terbit tahun 2020. Lalu juga tahun 2017 gitu ya, ada juga dan bahkan bukan cuma buku-buku, kalian juga bisa akses berbagai artikel. Jadi itu soal Prof. Eric. Nah, anyway, teman-teman bisa banget gunakan kolom chat untuk berkomentar, untuk berpendapat. Gitu. Jadi kalau ada tanya-tanya, silakan sampaikan di kolom chat kalian. Oke? Aku akan menggunakan bahasa Inggris. Prof. Eric juga. Aku usahakan untuk terjemahkan sebaik mungkin. Ya. Oke, kita langsung aja. So, Prof. Eric, thank you so much. It is really it's really great to have you here. Yeah, we're really humbled for your. You came at 4 a.m. there in California to talk with us here in Indonesia, and yeah, it's really great. Thank you, Prof. Eric.
Thank you for the invitation. It's very nice to be here, and I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Yeah, actually, there are around 100 people who registered to the events, but I think some of them going through the YouTube because we also make it accessible to watch at YouTube channel, right. our YouTube channel.
Okay, that's
so
fine.
We'll talk about Taoism, but before we talk about Taoism, I want to ask you some other questions regarding philosophy. We always first ask our interviewees what philosophy is for them, and also we want to ask you what philosophy is for you, and how could you be first introduced to philosophy, and at the end, why did you decide to indulge in academic philosophy?
Mm-hmm. Well, those are very interesting questions for everyone who's a philosopher and other people as well, because one of the preeminent questions of philosophy is what is philosophy? And so all of us as philosophers, we need to consider what we're doing reflectively as philosophers and question the very practice that we're undertaking. And so philosophy has this reflexivity built into it from the very beginning. We see that, for example, in Socrates about what is the good life, what does it mean to reflect upon the good life, and so on. So my understanding of philosophy is broader than a mere technical, scientific, or systematic medium. So I know some have a very narrow idea of what philosophy is and should be. But on the other hand, I also think philosophy has constraints on what it is, because it has to involve a self-reflection and a reflection on one's circumstances and one's world, and engagement with that. So philosophy is broader than a mere systematic, logical understanding of a, say, conceptual system, but it's also narrower than just any kind of opinion or ideas about the world. And so, of course, if you're on an airplane, like in the old days when we used to fly, people would ask you what you're doing. And I would say, well, philosophy, I teach philosophy. And then they're always like, well, I have a philosophy too. But usually what ordinary people mean by philosophy is just their set of opinions or their worldview. And I think there's a philosophical dimension to worldviews and opinions, but they become philosophical through questioning, through reflection. So one thing that is necessary for the art of philosophizing is to not just assert opinions or ideas or propositions, but to question the very status and nature and goal of these opinions, ideas, and so on. And so in German philosophy, there was a long debate between philosophy as worldview and philosophy as systematic science. And I think both sides tended to be a little bit one-sided in what they understood philosophy to be, because philosophy as systematic science is overly narrow if we think of philosophy as also involving all sorts of existential questions about the nature of meaning and value in our existence. But on the other hand, philosophy as worldview can be overly naive or limited insofar that excludes the very character of philosophy as questioning, debate, argumentation, reflection, all of which brings forth a philosophical consciousness that is different than, say, our naive, ordinary understanding of the world. So philosophy really has to move between these two aspects, these two dimensions, right, of wanting to be a systematic, logical science, which is, for most of us, an impossible ideal under the current conditions of knowledge. But on the other hand, not just any kind of opinions about, what kind of fashion to have or something like that as well. So philosophy is in between in having this questioning character. And how I got drawn into philosophy is precisely through this kind of questioning character of philosophy. So long before I thought I would ever study philosophy academically, back when I was a teenager in Chicago, I started reflecting upon politics, about nature of society, about the nature of religion, and I had a lot of questions about them. And so I started reading various history, political science books, and I found them interesting. But somehow something was missing there that I wanted something more fundamental to be addressed. And that's namely this question of the question, right? Of why is society the way it is? Why is the world the way it is? And so I began by reading philosophers such as Bertrand Russell and Jean-Paul Sartre. And they excited my imagination and my thought to question myself and the environment around me. So philosophy has always been linked to questioning for me. And pursuing questions is the essence of philosophy, insofar as I understand it. And how I got into academic philosophy is more of a longer story because I had this philosophical interest. But of course, in high school, we never imagined that we'll go to college and study philosophy or would continue to go to graduate school and then make a career of it. So I never actually imagined I would become a academic philosopher. I just thought I would read a few books and do something more worldly, business or law or whatever it might be. But as an undergraduate, I was really enthralled by philosophical questions. Again, so what drew me into philosophical courses was exactly the way the professors pursued questions. They would state not just something is true, like in many other scientific and other courses, you learn propositions, you learn statements, you learn theories, but you don't learn how to question, how to do things with those theories and propositions. And when I was in a philosophy class, we questioned what the truth of that philosopher was, what the truth of a philosophical position is. And so it's the very art of questioning that appealed to me. And I ended up taking more and more philosophy classes. And my family thought that was kind of eccentric. And so I needed an excuse for studying philosophy. And so I just told my family I was studying pre-law because many people would take philosophy as an undergraduate major in the US and then go to law school. But of course, I never wanted to go to law school. I always wanted to be a philosopher, and I was lucky enough to be able to pursue this into graduate school and then as a career as well. So in that sense, I've been very fortunate to be able to live in this passion for questioning, right, of investigating what it means to exist, what it means for society to be just or good, what is the natural world, and so on. So that's a brief introduction to my kind of trajectory of what I became interested in philosophy and a certain kind of philosophy involving the question.
I see. Okay. Do you still remember what is the first book you ever read
Actually,
about
yes, I do. So the first book I read was Bertrand Russell's Why I Am Not a Christian. So
Yeah,
many
yeah.
people in that environment, right, were very conservative or in religion and politics. And this, of course, I had a lot of doubts about how they connected religion and politics. And
Yeah,
so
yeah.
one reason I looked into, say, critiques of Christianity, but also critiques of existing politics. Like I
Mm,
read Sartre as well because of his later political writings at that time, was because of how religion and politics were formed in a certain way to be very coercive and very manipulative in my understanding of society at that time. And that was in
yeah,
the late 1980s.
yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
so,
Actually, yeah. Russell's Why I'm Not a Christian also is some of the first books I ever read in my
oh,
undergraduate.
wow.
Also, I have one at my house. Yeah.
Yes. I
But
think
please
many
let me
people
finish
are
the book.
introduced. Yeah, and I think many people are introduced to philosophy through works like that, right? If they're interested in religion, for example, or read a critique of religion, that's a very useful one for thinking in the 20th century about the nature of religion, even today as well. And so they're very nice essays, whether you agree with them or not, they give you a lot to reflect upon. And of course, one of the things
Okay.
I was interested in was the question of suffering, right? Why is there human suffering? And so that's a political, a social question, but it's also a question of the nature of the world. How could a just God create an unjust, world with so much suffering in it? So, of course, this question of theodicy was also one that was very compelling for me. And this is one of the reasons I studied Leibniz for a while as well, who, of course, has a very different position than Russell. Although Russell thought
Oh,
Leibniz was a secret atheist, of course.
yeah. Okay, Prof. Eric, let me translate it in some way, very brief to the participants. Oke, jadi pertanyaanku teman-teman tadi soal apa sih filsafat itu dan kenapa Prof. Eric tuh mau akhirnya jadi filsuf lah kasarnya begitu. Sebenarnya pertanyaan soal filsafat itu sangat luas gitu ya. Dan itu adalah salah satu pertanyaan yang harus dijawab sama seorang filsuf. Jadi misalnya Socrates ya. Apa sih kehidupan yang baik itu? Itu kan salah satu pertanyaan yang diajukan sama Socrates. Dan filsafat itu dulu berkaitan erat dengan soal kehidupan yang baik. Nah, filsafat itu lebih luas dari soal yang teknikal saja. Tetapi juga soal kehidupan. Soalnya terlalu sempit nih kalau bicara filsafat cuma soal logika. Nah, kalau kata Prof. Eric, kalau di pesawat gitu ya, kalau ketemu orang-orang terus tanya pekerjaannya apa, ngajar filsafat, gitu. Mereka itu berpikir bahwa filsafat itu sama seperti falsafah gitu ya, cara pandang dunia doang. Nah, padahal lebih dari itu juga sebenarnya. Jadi filsafat itu yang penting adalah soal pertanyaannya, gitu ya, upaya pencarian ide, filosofisi, dan yang terutama pertanyaan. Nah, kalau di Jerman sendiri ada perdebatan nih antara filsafat sebagai sebuah ilmu atau sebagai sebuah pandang dunia atau worldview. Kalau bicara sebagai ilmu itu terlalu sempit karena filsafat juga berkaitan dengan pertanyaan-pertanyaan eksistensial. At the same time, terlalu sempit juga kalau misalnya ngomong sebagai suatu worldview. Karena filsafat itu juga penuh dengan nuansa debat di sana, refleksi, mempertanyakan gitu. Jadi kita harus ada in the between ya di antara yang apa namanya sebagai ilmu dan juga sebagai yang pandang dunia. Nah, Prof. Eric tuh tertarik pertama-tama ketika jadi remaja di Chicago gitu ya, itu baca-baca soal apa itu politik, ya soal masyarakat, agama dan segala macam. Nah, jadi hal-hal itu menarik, tapi ada yang kurang gitu kan, yaitu terkait dengan pertanyaan mengenai pertanyaan gitu ya, mengapa masyarakat seperti ini, mengapa dunia seperti ini dan sebagainya. Dan salah satu buku yang dibaca sama Prof. Eric adalah Hustle, Why I Am Not a Christian. Itu buku lumayan tipis ya. Itu oke sih ya untuk mengantar gitu, untuk menjadi kritis terhadap isu-isu agama dan juga baca tulisannya Sartre. Gitu karena itu erat kaitan dengan politik kata Prof. Eric. Nah, jadi soal pertanyaan itu adalah yang paling esensial. Nah, jadi kenapa akhirnya jadi philosopher? Sebenarnya nggak nyangka-nyangka ya kayak saya. Gitu. Saya juga nggak nyangka kalau belajar filsafat ya, dan tertarik untuk menjadikannya sebagai sebuah karir. Ya, Prof. Eric juga sama, saya gitu ya. Pada akhirnya dia merasa beruntung untuk bisa berkarir. So, Prof. Eric, by the way, LJ Saraswati is one of my lecturers here in University of Indonesia. Yeah, he also teach Eastern philosophy, Hinduism, etc. Yeah.
Oh, great.
Yeah. I think maybe later Mbak Yayas want to ask some questions, but
good. We can talk as well.
Let's go to other questions.
I look forward to it.
Prof. Eric. Yeah. I want to ask about your interest in Taoism. Why do you have an interest in Taoism or Chinese philosophy in general at first?
Thank you for that question as well. So even though in terms of my work in Asian philosophy, I focus on Chinese, Taoism and Buddhism, and then a little Confucianism to a lesser extent. My initial interests in Asian philosophy actually were somewhat different because I began with a fascination with Buddhism. So already in my high school years back in Chicago, I was reading Buddhist literature, and I was interested in Tibetan and Japanese Buddhism in particular. And so in my initial years of studying Asian philosophy, I actually focused on classical Buddhist schools such as Madhyamaka and Yogacara, especially as reflected in Tibetan Buddhism. But also I was very fascinated by Zen Buddhism and how it was taken up in the Kyoto school, for example, and then in the West as well. So throughout my college years, I actually studied Buddhism quite extensively. So I didn't major in Asian studies as an undergraduate, but I took a number of courses. I took Japanese for a while, although my Japanese is very poor these days. And I studied Japanese and Asian, other Asian forms of Buddhism and religion and philosophy as well. So I had this general background that focused more on Japan, but then in my first philosophy position, I met one of my good Chinese friends who's in Shenzhen now, near Hong Kong. And he actually had a nice conversation about Chinese philosophy, and because I was telling him about my interest in Zen Buddhism and so on. Then he goes, "Oh, Eric, I think you'd really like this book called the Zhuangzi." And then I picked up this book and I became totally enthralled by it. So after that, I began to systematically study Chinese philosophy and the Chinese language, and I gradually taught courses on it and wrote more and more papers and eventually books on it and so on. And so it was Taoism, especially in the Zhuangzi at first, that really transformed my way of understanding language and experience and the nature of reality as well. And so I think Taoism has a sort of unique way of approaching the world and our role within it that I found very appealing and very intriguing. And that's why I pursued it further. But at the same time, I maintained my interest in various forms of Buddhism. And as a teacher and writer about Asian philosophy, of course, I became familiar with Confucianism. And then also, I've worked on Indian traditions to a lesser extent, but I'm also fascinated by them as well. And so from that initial point of departure, I think Taoism speaks to me in a way that goes very to the heart of certain questions, right? And so I also enjoy in the Zhuangzi how there's a kind of playfulness, a kind of humor. It works with paradoxes in ways that are productive. And so one feature of certain forms of Asian philosophy, Buddhist, Taoist, and certain forms of Hinduism, is they rely on paradox to further questioning, to further self-reflection. And I think paradox can be part of a productive process of coming to an understanding of what is going on, both in the external world and within oneself as well. And in the Taoist case of a text like the Zhuangzi, it combines a certain kind of philosophical depth and seriousness, but also with a humor at the same time, with a kind of irony and laughter. And I think that whole combination of the, say, literary or rhetorical side of the Zhuangzi with this profound philosophical side makes the Zhuangzi one of the most appealing philosophical texts for me that I've encountered in my life. So that would be a
Could you share
introduction to that.
one stories maybe that you think the most one of the paradoxes or the humor that a bit maybe? Is there any stories you can share a bit?
Yes, so certain of course there are world traditions of mysticism and negative philosophy that use paradox and negativity and negative forms of argument and so on. So of course that's a very interesting field in itself, and there are Western say mystics like Meister Eckhart or Jewish and Islamic ones and so on. So I think the art of negativity, if you want to call it the art of paradoxicality, reoccurs, particular in cases where we want to push reflection beyond where it stands, say in the status quo, and to produce a kind of transformation. So paradoxical thinking can produce transformations in one's own self-understanding, but also in the understanding of others. And one thing I really enjoy about classical Taoist texts, such as the Tao Te Ching attributed to Lao Tzu and the Zhuangzi, is that they kind of are about transformation, but they don't only talk about transformation from the outside, but they, in a way, performatively enact transformation. And if one follows along with the text, one can enact those possibilities of transformation within oneself at the same time. So in a sense, the Tao Te Ching and Zhuangzi don't only prescribe or describe an art of transformation through paradox, but they enact it. And if we read and interpret in such a way that we enact it as well, we can also transform our way of understanding and experiencing the world. So in that sense, there's a deeply practical side to Taoism, even though, of course, classical Taoist teachings seem very unpractical, right? Because they teach against the art of practicality. But they're practical in the sense that they direct us towards a kind of practice, a kind of enactment of the ideas of the propositions that we are reading about, so that we cannot simply fixate on what is said, but rather we have to realize what is said through its saying, through its being unsaid, through its being reversed, through its producing a kind of paradox, right, that we have to work through. And so I think genuine paradoxical thinking doesn't want to resolve the paradox or contradiction, as quickly as possible to achieve a harmony or synthesis. And so this is one reason why I'm critical of Hegel, for example, and particular ways of reading Hegel, is that Hegel sees the kind of contest and struggle, antagonism, right, contradiction is part of the structure of reality and part of the structure of thinking. But at the same time, he emphasizes a little bit too quickly the resolution of the paradox, of the contradiction. And I think when we look at contradictions and paradoxes and say that they're all true or that they can all be harmonized in a particular way, then they lose their very efficacy, which is to put ourselves in question and thus transform us. So certain logicians want to develop an alternative logic that says all contradictions are true, right? Or within a certain system, they're all true. But that actually removes the very power of the paradox in challenging us and provoking us and trying to make us think and reflect and engage ourselves more deeply. And so one thing I found very appealing, both in classical Taoism and so-called Neo-Taoism later on, but also in Chan and Zen Buddhism, is this art of developing doubt, of uncertainty, of questionability in a particular way that results in a kind of transformation of our perspective and point of view. So also in Chan Buddhism and Zen Buddhism, there is a tradition of koan meditation, where one meditates on a kind of paradox to the point that it becomes what they call the great doubt. And of course, it does not end with this great doubt in a kind of skepticism or indifference, but rather this great doubt is the pivot of a transformation, of a spiritual awakening. And so I think that this kind of art of paradoxical thinking, of embracing the contradiction precisely in its being contradictory, can result in this kind of awakening or transformation. And that's one of the things I've learned, I think, from studying Taoist classics and Buddhist ones as well.
Okay, so interesting. Please let me translate Prof. Eric to the participants. Jadi agak panjang ya teman-teman ya. Saya nggak yakin bisa terjemahin semuanya. Tetapi kurang lebih Prof. Eric itu tertarik belajar Buddhisme sejak SMA. Gitu ya. Dia baca tulisan Buddhis dari Jepang. Gitu ya. Jadi Buddhisme Jepang itu Zen Buddhism. Nah, termasuk ketika dia belajar filsafat, fokusnya juga di Buddhisme tadinya, terutama yoga cara dan sebagainya. Nah, lalu ada juga sekolah Kyoto. Gitu ya. Nah, di kuliah belajar lagi Buddhisme, meski bukan Asian Studies. Dan juga belajar bentuk Buddhisme lainnya seperti Buddhisme Jepang, gitu ya. Jadi dia tadi fokusnya di Jepang, terus kemudian ketika dapat posisi di salah satu akademisi, salah satu universitas, yaitu diskusi sama teman Chinese-nya, dan ngobrol soal filsafat Cina yang membawanya ke dalam salah satunya Taoism, gitu ya. Dan akhirnya dia memutuskan untuk belajar filsafat dan bahasa Cina secara sistematis yang membuatnya mengubah banyak hal terkait pemahamannya soal bahasa, soal diri, dan bahkan soal dunia. Nah, Taoisme buat beliau, buat Prof. Eric itu adalah suatu hal yang sangat menarik untuk cara kita memandang dunia, gitu ya. Terutama terkait dengan kedekatannya dengan paradoks, gitu ya. Jadi Taoisme itu banyak bicara hal terkait soal paradoks itu sendiri, gitu ya. Paradoks buat Prof. Eric menjadi cara yang menarik juga untuk memahami dunia, dan katanya gitu ya, kalau baca teks-teks Asia itu banyak juga ya isinya humor gitu ya, isinya juga soal keraguan, tapi nuansanya lebih sastrawi dibandingkan kalau misalnya kita baca Descartes gitu ya. Baca Descartes kan kering banget gitu ya, malesin juga gitu. Nah kalau baca ini enggak gitu ya, sastra lah katanya. Dan dari paradoks tersebut, kata Prof. Eric, itu suatu hal yang buat dia bisa mentransformasi diri. Tao Te Ching misalnya, gitu ya. Dan Tao Te Ching itu melakukan deskripsi itu bukan cuma lewat paradoks, tapi berusaha untuk enact ya, INACT gitu ya. Gitu. Dan soal meditasi juga tadi buat dia poin yang menarik. Tapi anyway, aspek transformasi di dalam Taoisme itu yang aku rasa menjadi menarik buat Prof. Eric, dan terutama ya bagaimana paradoks itu menjadi salah satu cara untuk mencapai transformasi tersebut. Nah, ini transformasinya bagaimana segala macam. Mungkin kita lanjut ke pertanyaan-pertanyaan berikutnya. Sekarang aku mau nanya, seringkali orang-orang kan memandang yang namanya filsafat Asia bukan sebagai filsafat, gitu ya. Apalagi kata Immanuel Kant, orang Asia tidak bisa berfilsafat. Nah, kita coba tanya nih, apakah memang benar seperti itu? Prof. Eric, I want to continue the questions regarding Asian philosophy. We often hear that Asian philosophy, i.e. Chinese, Japanese, or even in Indonesia, Nusantara philosophy, could not be called as a philosophy because compared to the so-called Western or European philosophy, Asian philosophy is not a systematic way of thinking, but more of a practical or wisdom way to life, or practical or wisdom way to life. How do you respond to that? Should we, Asian philosophy, have our own definition of philosophy?
So thank you for the question. That's a really good question, Samuel. And I also wrote my 2017 book on this question. That's part of the topics I addressed. And I think the nature of philosophy, again, is a preeminently philosophical question. So I encourage everyone who's a philosopher who thinking about philosophy to engage in the question, what is philosophy? And for me, I think part of the problem is that the West developed a certain idea of what philosophy is and should be that is untrue to the Western origins of philosophy. And so the problem is that modern philosophy is not what philosophy meant, say, in classical Greece or in Rome or even in the Middle Ages, or even to a certain extent in the early modern period as well. Because if we look at philosophy from the Greeks through the Romans, the medievals, the early moderns, and so on, they all recognize that philosophy can be pursued in a variety of ways. Philosophy is not just the question of, say, systematic, logical theorizing about some question or proposition, but rather it results in a certain kind of wisdom or insight into the question being asked, posed, and addressed. And of course, Socrates himself, the ultimate philosophical question was, what sort of life should I be living? What is the good life? And so philosophy occurs whenever there's the question of what is a good life? What is the nature of society that I want to live in? What should a society look like? What is the nature of the world, of reality, and so on? So I think those are preeminently philosophical questions according to the very origins of what philosophy was in the West. But unfortunately, in the modernity, philosophy has often been identified with a certain, very narrow vision of what philosophy should be. Philosophy as a, say, systematic science, philosophy as a certain kind of logic applied then to every question that's available. And that later conception of philosophy, that much more narrow one, develops in fact in the late Enlightenment with, and especially in German idealism. So it's really Kant and Hegel and those great philosophers we admire in so many ways who define philosophy in such a way as to exclude much of what was counted as philosophy earlier. So even in the 18th century, in 18th century German philosophy, we have figures like Leibniz, Christian Wolff, Baumgarten, Meyer, and so on, engaging with an area of inquiry that they called a worldly wisdom, Weltweisheit. And worldly wisdom, Weltweisheit, dealt with all sorts of questions about the nature of reality, our existence within it, about society, and so on. And through this notion of worldly wisdom, philosophers like Leibniz and Wolff, even though they were highly logically oriented thinkers, right, highly systematic, recognized the philosophical moment and other traditions besides their own. And so Leibniz and Wolff, for example, had great appreciation for Chinese philosophy, in which they saw kind of systematic thinking going on about the nature of the cosmos and the nature of reality. So I think part of the problem is how we've narrowly construed philosophy, especially in modernity, that philosophy becomes linked with a certain conception of systematic science. And even though we no longer believe philosophy is a science in that sense, that idea, that commitment remains. And so many Western philosophers, but also those educated in Western philosophy throughout the world, are suspicious of other ways of doing philosophy or posing philosophical questions. But if we define philosophy not just as a transmission or tradition from the Greeks to the Germans, or to from the Greek antiquity to the modern West, we can see rather that philosophy is the art of pursuing reflection, the art of asking questions about who we are, what we are doing, what is the nature of reality. And if we look at philosophy in that way, we can see that philosophy indeed has multiple sources, multiple origins, multiple contexts. So for example, in India and China, but also Persia, Israel, and all of the ancient world, wherever one goes, one sees reflection about what one is doing, questioning about what is a good life, what is the right life to lead, what is justice, and so on. And so there's always this practical questioning going on, this practical reflection wherever we see cultures being formed, but there's also this more theoretical questioning about the nature of the cosmos. And so often within these other cultural contexts, of course, philosophy is linked with certain religious traditions or in opposition to them. So we see that particularly in India, it's a highly philosophical culture, but at the same time, philosophical debate, argumentation, reflection is linked with the religious traditions, but also certain forms of opposition to those religious traditions. Whereas in the ancient Chinese context, of course, philosophy is linked with the question of the good life for the community and not just solely for the individual. But there's also a reflection upon the nature of nature itself, as we see in the ancient Taoist texts or in the later Neo-Confucian ones. So as soon as there's reflection, right, as soon as there's an attempt to question and reflect upon the nature of oneself and one's world and the nature of one's community, I think philosophy is occurring regardless of how we want to define the word philosophy in an overly narrow way. So philosophy should be an opening up to all sorts of forms of questioning and reflection. And to that extent, we can say philosophy occurs not just in Europe or the Occident or the West, but throughout all these various cultural and social milieus. And I think this means that philosophy is not just a systematic science, nor is it merely, say, the anthropology or the worldview of a people, right? And so I think people committed to the idea of philosophy very much worry about, say, a certain idea that comes from multiculturalism and so on, that any kind of worldview of a people is philosophy. So when people say Indonesian philosophy, do you mean the opinions of all Indonesian people, a certain spirit underlying the Indonesian people, and so on? And the philosophers would want that to be a little bit more precise. That it would have to involve a certain kind of reflection and interrogation and questioning. But I think even if we call for philosophy to involve questioning, interrogation, argument, and so on, we can still say that there's philosophy occurring in Indonesia, in China, in India, and so on. And so I think there is a tension then in how philosophy is conceived of itself. On the one hand, we have philosophy as a kind of modern academic scientific discipline. And of course, that seems to be narrow to the Western world. We also have this idea popular in German philosophy that philosophy is inheritance from the Greeks that then is recreated by, say, Hegel or Heidegger. And both of those conceptions of philosophy limit philosophy to a certain way of speaking and thinking that fits into a certain picture of the modern West. But in many ways, that is an ideological vision of what philosophy was, because that vision of philosophy is a creation of the 18th, 19th, and 20th century. Even if we look at someone as recent as Leibniz or Wolff, that is not the conception of philosophy that they had. So the conception of philosophy I have, I think, is more true, if you want to call it that, to the Western tradition of philosophy, which does recognize philosophy among the Egyptians and Sumerians and so on, as the Greeks knew. The Greeks very much knew that philosophy occurred in all sorts of neighboring countries and that they were not doing it all on their own. But at the same time, they thought they were doing it in a particular way that made it, say, Greek philosophy. And so I think we have to recognize that philosophy can be done in a particular way within a given culture, whether it be Greece or Indonesia. But at the same time, we should recognize that philosophy pursues for a kind of self-questioning of oneself, but also one's society and the order of the world as well. And so I think philosophy always has to have this aspirational side of questioning, of argument, right, or the possibility thereof to be philosophy. And that's what makes it not simply the assertion of a set of views or opinions, but a kind of discipline that is not, of course, a natural science, and should be not thought along the lines of natural science, but still has its own discipline and rigor at the same time. But it's a discipline and rigor of a person asking a question, posing a question, and then pursuing that question to see where it results, whether it be for or against the, say, existing way of believing in things, right?
I want want to make a follow-up questions, but I think I need to translate it and continue to the other questions about
Sure.
Taoism itself. Please let me translate it, Prof. Eric. Jadi ya lagi-lagi panjang banget ya teman-teman ya. Nah jadi sebenarnya pertanyaan soal naturalisme filsafat ini ditulis sama Prof. Eric di dalam salah satu bukunya di tahun 2017 yang judulnya itu adalah, kalian bisa cari sendiri sih ya di Google Scholar. Tapi tahun 2017 itu beliau nulis buku yang berjudul Chinese and Buddhist Philosophy in Early 20th Century German Thought gitu ya. Itu bisa kalian cek kalau penasaran. Nah itu dia tulis soal apa itu filsafat itu. Nah jadi adalah sebuah permasalahan bagi cara pandang Barat ya, untuk memahami yang namanya filsafat semata sebagai yang sistematis saja. Ya, karena kalau kita coba untuk mundur lebih jauh gitu ya, filsafat Yunani, terus di Roma dan bahkan abad pertengahan, mereka paham bahwa sesuatu bisa dipahami dengan berbagai cara, bukan cuma soal yang teoritis, tapi soal kebijaksanaan. Nah, Socrates sendiri pun ya bertanya-tanya soal bagaimana cara hidup yang baik. Gitu ya. Filsafat selalu bertanya soal artinya hidup. Gitu. Jadi terlalu sempit gitu untuk memahaminya sebagai semata yang sistematis. Nah, sayangnya di zaman yang modern gitu ya, sejak zamannya Kant, Hegel dan kawan-kawan, mereka punya konsepsi yang lebih sempit, gitu ya, memahami filsafat dengan cara memikirkan apa yang dahulu dianggap filsafat gitu ya. Padahal pada saat yang sama orang-orang seperti Leibniz, terus ada juga Baumgarten, Mayer, itu mereka pahamin bahwa filsafat memang lebih kompleks ya. Ada yang namanya world to wisdom gitu ya, lebih luas daripada apa yang dipahami Kant dan kawan-kawan gitu ya. Mereka sadar akan keberadaan daripada tradisi-tradisi filsafat lainnya yang juga penting, tapi Chinese philosophy yang sebenarnya juga sistematis gitu ya. Soal siapa kita, apa yang perlu kita lakukan, siapa itu komunitas ya. Dan seringkali mereka juga berkaitan dengan tradisi-tradisi agama gitu loh. Nah, oleh karena itu makanya yang poin penting daripada Prof. Eric ini adalah bahwa intinya yang namanya berfilsafat itu pun punya konteks kulturnya masing-masing gitu loh. Jadi kita nggak bisa mengatakan bahwa yang di Asia ini ya, orang-orang Indonesia, orang-orang China itu nggak berfilsafat, mereka cuma beragama. Enggak gitu ya. Esensinya sebenarnya adalah bahwa selama kita memperhatikan soal diri, dunia, dan komunitas, maka yang namanya tindakan untuk berfilsafat sedang terjadi, gitu ya. Nah, makanya filsafat harus lebih open, ya, harus lebih terbuka daripada sekedar perkara yang sistematis. I think we should going back to the first question regarding to make philosophy in between the worldviews and the systematic way of thinking, I guess, yes. Prof. Eric. Yeah. Okay. Let's go to the today the point of today's discussions. I want to ask you about Taoism. In Europe or Greek, we have Thales, who is considered by some people as the first Hellenistic philosopher. How about Taoism? Does it have any so-called provenance? And how does Taoism itself develop historically? Could you share with us?
Yes, thank you. So this is a very complicated question because there are many ways of defining what Taoism is. So first off, there's the early text that we call Taoist, but certain scholars of religious Taoism, for example, think they're more pre-Taoist. And those early texts are, of course, the Tao Te Ching, the most classic work to begin with in the study of Taoism. And that is attributed to a figure named Lao Tzu. But of course, Lao Tzu is a quasi or perhaps definitely a mythical figure. We don't know if such a person ever truly existed. And we don't know if he exists in the way that we think that he did at that time. And so the Lao Tzu is probably a fictional combination of a variety of historical writers. And also the Tao Te Ching is itself a composite text from a variety of sources. And so from this historical fact, right, we have to take into mind that Taoism combines a variety of different ideas together. And we see that both in the Tao Te Ching. So we can give it a consistent reading, but often we find there are passages that are in tension with one another. And this is also true of the second canonical work of early or proto-Taoism, if you want to call it that, the Zhuangzi, attributed to the figure Zhuangzi. That too is a combination of a variety of texts. And some of them, some have tried to reconstruct what the historical Zhuangzi might have been like, in contrast to his students or other followers who are included within in that work. So Lao Tzu and Zhuangzi are the basis of what we would call early or proto-Taoism, the kind of Taoism that many of us think of outside of China, right, when we hear the word Taoism. And this was the Taoism that philosophy, especially during the Han Dynasty, historians began to classify the schools. What they classified Taoism as being was what they called the Lao Huang form of Taoism, which is Lao Tzu and the Yellow Emperor. And that's actually a kind of natural cosmological way of conceiving reality, but also a political philosophy at the same time. So even very early, we see a variety of different ideas of what Taoism might be. Some have a more playful, more anarchistic character, especially in the Zhuangzi. And if we read the Tao Te Ching in light of the Zhuangzi, we might push that interpretation further there. But another form of Taoism is closer to more of a kind of way of ruler for the king to socially organize things and to arrange society in accordance with nature itself. And so these two forms of Taoism, if we want to call it two forms, have many overlapping features, but at the same time, they have certain opposing tendencies as well. So one strain of Taoism that leads into the so-called Neo-Taoism, the mysterious learning school after the end of the Han Dynasty, focuses more on this kind of anarchistic, spiritual side of the Tao Te Ching and the Zhuangzi. It has a more playful understanding of reality, and also it has important consequences for how they conceive society as well. So certain writers in the Taoist or Neo-Taoist tradition think that, for example, the way of the ruler is flawed, and there should just be the spontaneity of nature and the spontaneity of the people ruling themselves. So already in very ancient texts, right, in some sections of the Lietza text, also in other texts criticized by Gohong, there's a kind of quasi-anarchistic tendency in politics. But at the same time, there's this Lao Huang tendency that emphasizes how the art of the ruler is to rule through Wu Wei. And Wu Wei is a central notion for all these early forms of Taoism. It literally means not or non-action. But of course, it has a deeper philosophical meaning in many of these texts. And there's a lot of debate about whether Wu Wei simply means a kind of minimal action or not doing anything in a certain sense, or is it a certain kind of disposition or attunement in relationship to the world? Or in fact, is it a kind of responsiveness to things? And so in my book that just came out, sorry to plug this, Taoism and Environmental Philosophy, it's available in electronic form as well. I argue that actually Wu Wei comes to mean a kind of responsiveness to things and a responsiveness to the world. So if we read the Tao Te Ching in light of, say, the Wang Bi commentary, for example, it is a responsiveness to the thing that we're trying to arrive at. So Wu Wei would then be a kind of non-coercive activity, an activity that is respectful or reverent towards the objects with which it is acting. And another dimension of Wu Wei, non or not action, that is brought out in the Wang Bi commentary is that Wang Bi often interprets the non as nothingness. So that Wu Wei is actually acting in a way out of nothingness, comporting oneself and responding out of nothingness towards things. So a really central key concept of Taoism then is this notion of Wu Wei. And of course, there's been a lot of debate in modern scholarship about what Wu Wei means or can mean. And I think there are a variety of meanings in classical, early, or proto-Taoism. But after that, things become much more confusing because there's also different forms of literary Taoism that emerge after the Han Dynasty and the Three Kingdoms period, but also various forms of religious Taoism as well. And these various religious forms of Taoism take on the characteristics of a religion, where you have rituals and spirits and gods and so on and so forth. And so in China, in the Chinese world today, in Chinese communities, we still see religious Taoists practicing these various rituals. So to this extent, we have to understand that Taoism can mean a multiplicity or a variety, a plurality of different practices, ideas, doctrines, and teachings. They could be more of these ancient classics that have their religious dimensions, but are not purely directed at religious rituals and practices and so on, or they can mean these later religious tendencies with all of their practices and understandings of a spiritual reality and so on. But as a philosopher and as a Chinese scholar, I tend to focus on the earlier forms of Taoism, which present us with a certain way of understanding reality and nature, but also an art of attuning ourselves with nature and with the things that we encounter in the world. So that's what I focus on, for example, in much of my research on Taoism. So that's a brief introduction. I know it's a brief sketch, but hopefully it's helpful.
Yeah, it's okay. It's very good. So at the first time, Taoism is not understood as some kind of religion. It's
so part of the issue is that, of course, when people start to do things, they never call themselves by the label that they're given later. So the early existentialists are not existentialists, right? They don't use that term, but we use that for them. And so Lao Tzu, Zhuangzi, there's actually, they don't call themselves, they're teachers of the Tao, of the way in this broader sense, but they don't have a commitment to a kind of doctrinal, philosophical, or religious form of Taoism per se, right? And that's why we have to be careful about calling them Taoists. We should understand Taoism simply there as the teaching of the way, and they follow or enact a particular way of understanding the way, right?
Sure. Okay, please let me translate it a brief.
Sure.
Jadi agak kompleks untuk menerjemahkan soal apa itu Taoisme ya, atau mendefinisikan. Dan saya pun kesulitan menerjemahkannya sebenarnya. Tapi anyway, saya coba usahakan ya. Jadi pertama-tama itu bentuknya yang mula-mula itu Daois, pra-Daois gitu ya. Bentuknya religius pertama-tama dari tulisan-tulisan Tao Te Ching dari Lao Tzu. Nah, tapi sangat mungkin bahwa Lao Tzu ini hanya sebuah mitos gitu ya, fiksi antara beragam penulis yang ada di dalam zaman tersebut. Nah, Tao Te Ching itu jadi tulis sama banyak orang. Nah, lalu selain itu perlu juga diingat bahwa Tao Te Ching itu adalah tulisan yang sifatnya anakronistik gitu ya, mungkin nggak berkaitan. Nah, ada juga teks-teks lainnya yang meski itu perlu direkonstruksi. Jadi itu proto atau early Taoism pertama-tama gitu, dari Tao Te Ching. Nah, tapi di dinasti Han itu mulai ada mulai ada development-nya lagi tuh, ya. Cina mulai hadir banyak sekolah di dinasti Han, jadi mereka mulai mengklasifikasi. Gitu. Jadi interestingly, para pemikir tuh udah mampu, ini menarik banget ya, ternyata mereka mampu mengklasifikasikan pemikiran gitu loh. Nah, akhirnya yang namanya Taoism itu menjadi suatu cara pandang dunia dan filsafat politik gitu ya. Awalnya Taoisme itu lebih playful, lebih main-main, anakronistik, tapi kemudian di zaman hari ini Taoisme jadi sebuah cara bagi seorang pemimpin untuk memimpin negaranya dan mengatur masyarakat. Nah, dua bentuk ini meski begitu saling tumbang tindih. Setelah itu ada juga Neo-Taoism setelah Han gitu ya. Pemahamannya itu lebih spiritual lagi tuh, udah mulai cenderung agama gitu ya. Dan tapi di antara semua itu konsep yang paling utama di dalam Taoism adalah soal Wu Wei ya, artinya non-action. Ada banyak perdebatan lagi ya gitu ya, namanya Filsafat ya, didebatin juga tuh Wu Wei gitu ya. Apakah itu soal tindakan yang minimal atau kecenderungan atau relasi dengan dunia atau soal responsiveness gitu ya. Nah, kalau buat Prof Eric gitu ya, Wu Wei adalah sebuah tindakan respon kepada dunia. Nah, ada juga misalnya di komentarian Wang Di ya, Wu Wei itu adalah sebuah tindakan refleksi gitu ya. Atau di Wang Wei gitu ya, yang namanya Wu Wei itu adalah sebuah tindakan yang berasal dari ketidakberadaan. Pusing dong. Nah, tapi kemudian lebih lanjut lagi ya, setelah zaman Han itu Taoisme lebih banyak lagi ya. Ada Taoisme yang sifatnya lebih religius, punya ritual, ada Tuhan, ada roh-roh, dan sebagaimananya. Dan sekarang memang belakangan ini kan di Malaysia kah, di China sendiri, Taoisme itu menjadi satu bentuk yang lebih agama ya, gitu ya. Jadi ada ritual-ritual gitu loh. Nah, aku habis ini mau lanjut bertanya terkait soal topik-topik besar yang ada di dalam Taoisme. Ya, teman-teman kalau ada pertanyaan silakan tanya aja di chat. Prof Eric, I want to continue to the next questions. Could you share some big themes? Yeah, I think Wu Wei is one of them, one of the big themes that Taoism talk. But are there any some important like some keywords or big themes that Taoism is concerned about?
Right. So I think Wu Wei has been a central concept of Taoism that also Western scholars have focused on a lot. But sometimes that's been overly narrow, or it's been one-sided and focusing on Wu Wei without focusing on other key Taoist concepts. And all of these Taoist concepts have multiple roles because they're given a certain set of interpretations in early texts, such as the Tao Te Ching and the Zhuangzi, but often they're given a different interpretation or a different use in, say, later religious traditions. And so we have to bear that in mind as well. So one way of distinguishing these different forms of Taoism is to classify them under this notion of a kind of purposive Taoism, where Taoism is used as a set of techniques or instruments to kind of govern the nation by the king, or to relate to nature, or to relate to spirits and gods and so on. And so one has a particular purpose in mind with government or bio-spiritual practices, such as in contemporary times, Qigong and Tai Chi and so on. And that's purposive, and that is trying to realize a particular result. And one idea that's associated with purposive Taoism, but has a deeper or larger meaning than that, is the notion of yang sheng, nurturing life. And so nurturing life in later traditions is usually associated with nurturing one's body, one's spirit, one's heart, mind, and so on, through a set of practices involving one's qi, one's vital energy, and so on. And so I don't want to dismiss those practices and so on, but there's another way in which nourishing life is thought of in the Zhuangzi and in Wang Bi and other commentaries on the Tao Te Ching, although it's unclear whether this is true of the Tao Te Ching or not. And this is the idea that one realizes nurturing life not through having a specific goal of nurturing life, whether it be political or mystical or bio-spiritual, whatever it might be, but rather one can only realize nurturing life by letting go of such a conception of a purpose that one's life might have. And so there are many very interesting passages in the Zhuangzi and in Wang Bi's interpretation of the Tao Te Ching that I discussed in my recent Taoism book, where yang sheng is about not being purposive, but putting the purposive into question, or in order to realize the very essence of nurturing life. So nurturing life, what does it mean? Well, it means not just nurturing one's own egotistical life or one's own bio-spiritual life, but nurturing the life of the myriad things around one. So I think there's an intrinsic connection in the early Taoist context between Wu Wei as responsiveness to things and this notion of nurturing, nourishing the things around us, and thus nourishing ourselves as well. So nourishing life then is the second key concept, I would say, that's part of the Taoist tradition. And although philosophers try to avoid that notion because of the religious connotations and the purposiveness of it, I think actually it has a very interesting role in the Zhuangzi and in the commentatorial tradition of the Tao Te Ching as well. So we should not forget it to nourish life. And that's actually the subtitle of my book. So in addition to that, there are other, of course, key notions, and a number of key notions from Taoism have played a very important role in the Chinese and East Asian aesthetic understanding and experience of reality. So in the Tao Te Ching, there's an emphasis on becoming simple, on becoming plain, on dispersing the passions of becoming simple, and so on. So these practices, of course, one might say are practices of one's heart, mind, of one's understanding, one's body and spirit, one has to try to return to simplicity, return to plainness, return to a kind of purity, and so on. And through these practices of purification or simplification, if you want to call it that, one reaches a certain kind of tranquility of mind, or tranquil attitude in relationship to the things around one. But it's very interesting that these kinds of notions that are developed in the Tao Te Ching and then are played out in the early Taoist tradition become key elements of a certain kind of Chinese and then East Asian aesthetic. So simpleness, plainness, right? Kind of purity and so on. All of these become associated with how one relates to the natural world. So this is not just a way of relating to oneself, it's a way of relating to nature. And as a way of relating to oneself and nature, it becomes a way of producing art, calligraphy, painting, and so on, poetry and so on, are reflections of a certain kind of simplicity, certain kind of plainness, right? A kind of tranquility of the mind that allows one to responsively be in accord with or in attune with the thing that one is perceiving, that one is writing a poem about, that one is producing a painting about. So this aesthetic, right, is deeply informed by this earlier Taoist understanding of how to be in tune with the world and with oneself through a kind of reduction to simplicity. So that's another set of practices that are found in the Tao Te Ching that are important in all forms of Taoism, whether they're philosophical or religious or purposive or non-purposive, and also become crucial in the East Asian aesthetic traditions as well. And so, for example, there's been much discussion of Chinese painting, right? Why does it emphasize the blankness of the background, for example, or the brushstroke and the ink on the plainness of the paper? And all this is part of this aesthetic of plainness, right? And in plainness and simplicity is when things genuinely appear. So those are just a few of the notions of Taoism. Of course, there are many more, but those are a few key ones in my mind.
Yeah, it's really interesting to talk about nurturing life to be non-purposive. Is that right? Yeah, I think it's really important for us, like some millennials, Indonesian millennials, who often we have a lot of pressure from maybe social media to be
Yes.
what what my friends doing to take graduate studies, to
Yes.
take some jobs and many more. I think to be non-purposive is an interesting concept for us who have a lot of pressure from
Right.
from everyone around us. Yeah.
Right. I think it's really much a strategy that's already present because of the social pressures of even in antiquity, right? Even ancient peoples felt these kinds of anxieties and pressures. And so the Taoist response is to produce a kind of tranquility, is to kind of clean out and simplify the heart mind, one's condition in relationship to all the things that are happening around one. So all the things are twirling around, moving around, doing the things that they're doing, but we're no longer absorbed by them. We're no longer consumed by them, right? So for example, we simplify our tastes, so we're no longer worried about consuming only the most tasteful things and so on, right? And so it is a kind of counter consumeristic teaching if we draw an analogy with our own contemporary time, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. One of the participants said, "Yeah, it seems like life without productivity is a waste of time in the out." Yeah, yeah. Some
Right.
kind of social pressure that we have as a
Right.
as a millennials.
And so, of course, in Chinese society, there are always all sorts of social and family pressures. And it's interesting that Taoism has always been a way of responding and bracketing those pressures, right?
I see. Oh, it's very interesting. Please let me translate it, Prof. Arik.
Sure.
Ya, jadi ini poin yang menarik ya. Jadi tadi udah bahas ya, Wu Wei salah satu poin penting di dalam Taoism, tapi ada juga ada yang proto, ada yang baru ya. Cara bedanya Taoisme adalah teknik atau instrumen untuk memimpin negara, Tuhan dan segala macamnya. Tapi ada juga konsep nurturing life atau yang chang, tadi ya kalau nggak salah, memelihara tubuh, jiwa, pikiran dan hati, gitu, qi dan sebagainya, gitu ya. Ada juga nah, seseorang, ini poin menarik ya, memahami bahwa untuk memelihara hidup bukan soal punya tujuan gitu ya, tujuan politis, tujuan spiritual atau tujuan ekonomis mungkin, tapi untuk memelihara diri adalah soal untuk melepaskan konsepsi kita soal apa itu hidup yang sebenarnya gitu ya. Jadi mungkin beda banget kalau sama Aristoteles gitu ya, kita harus punya tujuan, harus punya telos gitu. Jadi kita harus kita punya konsepsi yang berbeda ya, non purposive gitu ya, non purposive ya, tanpa nggak bertujuan banget gitu ya. Menjadi tidak bertujuan justru berarti adalah untuk memelihara diri ya. Jadi memelihara diri, memelihara sekitar kita juga gitu ya. Nah, itu penting gitu ya. Dan tadi ya, ini poin penting gitu ya, karena di dalam konteks kita ya sebagai milenial gitu ya, orang-orang milenial yang dituntut sama ngelihat staff milenial di Indonesia gitu ya, atau ngelihat pengusaha-pengusaha muda itu kan banyak tekanan gitu ya. Tapi justru hal yang sama juga terjadi di dalam Cina kuno gitu ya, mereka punya tekanan keluarga, punya tekanan sosial juga gitu. Dan cara Taoisme adalah cara untuk menjadi non-purposive gitu ya. Mungkin kita bisa diskusi lebih lanjut kalau teman-teman ada pertanyaan. Yang kedua, selain soal cara hidup, terkait estetika juga itu dipengaruhi nih. Tao Te Ching itu menekankan pentingnya untuk menjadi sederhana atau polos, gitu ya. Jadi untuk kembali kepada kesederhanaan, kesucian melalui purifikasi, gitu ya, penyucian diri, tranquility of mind. Nah, jadi cara-cara seperti kaligrafi, menulis, puisi dan sebagainya itu sangat dipengaruhi sama estetikanya Tao Te Ching, gitu. Nah, salah satu contohnya adalah kalau misalnya kita lihat-lihat lukisan China, itu lukisannya banyak yang nggak penuh gitu ya. Kalau misalnya kita lihat lukisan Van Gogh lah misalnya gitu ya, itu kan penuh sama warna. Kalau lukisan China itu ada yang kosong gitu ya. Dan ternyata itu suatu hal yang dipengaruhi sama konsep ini ya, apa namanya, kembali kepada yang polos gitu di dalam Tao Te Ching. Jadi interesting banget gitu ya, ternyata sampai mempengaruhi cara melukis gitu ya daripada orang-orang China pada saat tersebut gitu.
Hello, Sam.
Hello?
Commute, Sam.
Yeah, sorry, Prof. Eric. Yeah, I want to continue the question.
Oh, sure, yeah.
Yeah. So how could Taoism, as an idea which was already 100 years old, be relevant for us as someone who lived in the 21st century? Other than, yeah, we already talk a bit about this, but could you add some other points?
Right. So I think we've already seen a few indications of how this might play out, right? So Taoism is a set of traditions that are go back, thousands of years, of course. And they've got all sorts of interpretations and reinterpretations and reapplications. But I think there are certain key teachings that do have significance for us today in the 21st century. So for example, we have already talked about our commodified, consumeristic society, where we always feel driven around to do all sorts of things, and we no longer feel centered in our lives. And so, of course, a Taoist practice would be on the individual level is to simplify, right? To return to the basics, to practice the minimalistic side of Wu Wei, of non-action, or to get to the responsive side of Wu Wei, where we can gently respond to things as they are. And so I think the idea of simplification, plainness, tranquilizing the heart, mind, one's body and spirit, and so on, has a certain way of keeping one centered and freeing one from anxiety in the midst of so many activities and concerns and everything else that presses upon us. So I think it has important individual lessons that are applicable even today. We can practice this kind of Taoist art of tranquility to calm ourselves in the midst of this world with all of its pressures, right, and so on. And of course, it doesn't mean that we do nothing at all. We just sit there like a rock, but rather our attitude is one where we simplify. So we act without acting, and that our actions are taking place, right? But we're no longer anxiously worried and concerned about them. We're no longer driven by fears about them and so on. So there's a kind of worldly liberation through the practice of these Taoist ideas. And that's one dimension, right? But I think in terms of the social thinking of the Tao Te Ching and Zhuangzi and say the interpretations that develop in Wang Bi and others, they also have important implications as well for how we think about not just the individual level of these kind of bio-spiritual meditative practices that might resolve certain questions for us as individuals, but it's also the social dimension of how we would have a, say, better society or a more natural society, one where we live more in accord with the rhythms and patterns of the natural world. And that's what my recent book on Taoism and environmental philosophy is about, that we need not just these individual practices, but we also need a social sensibility where we realize that society takes place in this greater fabric and network of nature, which it either reproduces and furthers, it nourishes the life of it, or it damages the life of it. So I think another key way that ancient Taoist teachings still have something to say to us today is in terms of ecology and the environment. There are many, say, models of ecological life that we find in these Taoist sources, texts, and traditions that we could maybe re-employ or rethink in our contemporary circumstances. to try to remodel how we relate to the rivers and streams, to the oceans, the mountains, the forests, and so on, that we recognize that they all have their intrinsic way of reproducing themselves, of generating themselves. And our role is not to undermine or destroy them, but rather to nourish them. And there's a certain notion of becoming great, right, in the Tao Te Ching. And one becomes great by nourishing the life around one. And I think that is a model that has a lot to say to us, both as individuals, but also as members of society as well. That as individuals, we flourish when we nourish others, not just ourselves, but also as societies, we flourish when we nourish others and not just that given society. So this requires redeveloping a more responsive way of relating to the natural world. So I think those are two examples of how Taoism can help shape our thinking today, of how to respond to, say, our consumeristic society, and how to respond to the present ecological crisis, right, which is having very devastating effects around the world. But I also think Taoism can be used to think about all sorts of different questions about biomedical issues, about governments, right? What is the best art of government is one where there's a certain self-generation or uh, self-governing of the people over themselves, right? So they can best realize what is good for themselves and so on. So there are all sorts of lessons that we can draw on even in contemporary circumstances. And of course, when you take an ancient text and compare it to the modern situation, there's always a kind of adjustment and reinterpretation that goes on at the same time. But we already do this with Western philosophers like Plato and Aristotle. People argue all the time. We can use Aristotle for virtue ethics today, or Plato to think about the state and so on. So if that's the case, why can't we think of the Tao Te Ching or Zhuangzi to think about a contemporary philosophical or social, political, or ethical question as well? So I think Taoism does have a lot to offer us today, precisely in that it is, say, non-purposive in a certain way. And by teaching us the non-purposive, it teaches us a way of realizing something we can only realize through the non-purposive. And at the same time, it is certain insights that are valuable in and of themselves to reflect upon and engage in. So I'm very adamant that Taoism remains important, even though at the same time I recognize that what we do with Taoism would not be what say, the Tao Te Ching or what the Zhuangzi did with it. That given our circumstances and conditions, we always reinterpret, redeploy, reapply, and so on in ways that would not be recognizable to, say, an ancient author. But I think that is just the very nature of ideas, of practices and so on, that we do adapt them to changing circumstances. And these Taoist classics themselves teach that, right? That we have to adapt to circumstances. So it would be totally in accordance with their teachings that we adopt their teachings to our own conditions and circumstances. I hope that
Yeah, it's really,
helps.
it's great. I
Great.
think other than your book Taoism and Environmental
Yes.
Philosophy, you also write an article called "Responding with Tao: Early Taoist
Yes.
Ethics and the Environment." Do you think it also talk about the later part, like how do we respond to the nature in this article?
Yes. So I wrote the article that you mentioned in 2009, and it's kind of a prototype for the book. But the book is much longer, more detailed, and deals much more both with the Chinese textual sources, but also with various environmental thinkers and environmental problems. So the book is much more complex and more careful than the article. But the article is kind of the preliminary way I thought about the issue back in 2009. So there's definitely a connection between the two. And of course, one thing I did already in the article a little bit, and I do more in the book, is I'm responding to many of the accounts of Taoism that already exist and arguments for why Taoism is not or does not say anything about the environment. And so I want to respond to the critics. So it's very interesting that in our popular understanding of Taoism, everyone thinks Taoism has something to say about nature, of course, how to be with nature and thus has environmental implications. And scholars and practitioners of religious Taoism have embraced that, right? They say Taoism is the green religion, the Chinese green religion, right? That will transform China into a green society and so on. But interestingly, even though the religious Taoists have embraced that, the Taoist philosophical scholars and sinologists have remained very skeptical, right? They say, oh, these are ancient texts. They have nothing to do with modern contemporary problems. We shouldn't mix them up, right? But my way of doing philosophy is a little bit broader or different than that, because I argue that we can interpret ancient ideas in relationship to modern problems. We recognize that there's a kind of anachronism in how we read an ancient text. And sure, it's anachronistic, but there's nothing wrong with that as long as that we are aware of that. And we use anachronism not as a rejection of an argument, but rather it's a vehicle for the argument. So anachronism can be very productive. We take an old text, whether it's Plato or Aristotle or the Tao Te Ching or the Buddha or whatever else it might be, and then we reinterpret it in relationship to our own conditions and circumstances. And I think that is preeminently philosophical to undertake such an endeavor, right? To not just treat a book as a dead set of words, right? Or a dead manuscript, but we want to think through it. And one way of thinking through a text is to adopt it in our own way, right? And so I think it's very actually Taoist to adopt Taoism in one's own way to one's own way of being and not being in the contemporary conditions under which one lives. And so my book responds to the critics of Taoism and certain understandings of Taoism as well, and thus shows how it is a way of thinking about the environment and ecology more broadly. And so there are a number of interpretations of Taoism where it seems that it cannot produce any kind of ethics. Because one popular Western interpretation of Taoism in its classical form, and Lao Tzu Zhuangzi, is that it's kind of indifference. It doesn't teach you to want to change or do anything, right? You're indifferent to everything in the world. And if you're in a state of indifference to the world, why would you be bothered about the environment then? But I think that argument about indifference, there is a kind of Taoist tradition that emphasizes indifference and neutrality and so on, but it's not the only one and not the primary one. And so I think the primary Taoist tradition from the Tao Te Ching through the Zhuangzi to Wang Bi and Guoshang and others is not indifference, but responsiveness. It's about becoming simple, tranquil, clarified, in order to be responsive and nourish the life of the things around one. And so Taoism teaches, and we see this in the Tao Te Ching and the Zhuangzi, right, to nourish life. And it doesn't say simply to nourish one's own life, but it says to nourish the life of things, right, without the limiting purpose of only nourishing one's own individual life. And so by nourishing the life of things, we get a different kind of ethos out of these Taoist texts. And this ethos is one that says a lot to our current environmental crisis. Because part of responding to this crisis is to get beyond limited purposes to think about the broader patterns of the natural world and allow those broader patterns to simply be what they are, to reproduce themselves, to self-generate, and to be nourishing of their self-reproduction, right? The reproduction of their life. And so nourishing life means allowing individuals, natural phenomena to reproduce and generate in their own way without undermining them, without diminishing them, or other negative effects. And so I try to reconstruct the Taoist ethos and show how this Taoist ethos is something that can shape how we relate to the environment and nature, and thus, in part, at least, address our current environmental crisis.
Yeah, I guess, yeah, it's interesting. Please let me translate it, Prof. Arik. Ya, jadi ini poin yang panjang lagi ya. Sayang sekali kalau aku harap teman-teman nggak depend sama terjemahanku dong ya, karena terjemahanku sangat terbatas dan mungkin nggak mencakup seluruh apa yang disampaikan Prof. Eric, tapi menarik banget ya. Salah satu poinnya itu ya, yang penting di dalam Taoisme buat kita sekarang ini adalah terkait usaha untuk melawan konsumerisme, gitu ya. Jadi panggilan untuk menjadi sederhana, gitu ya, di dalam Taoisme. Respon, bagaimana kita berespon kepada segala sesuatu sebagaimana mereka adanya. Nah, hal itu menolong kita untuk menghindar dari kekhawatiran. Tranquility untuk koin kucing ya. Jadi menyederhanakan untuk bertindak dengan tidak bertindak gitu loh. Nah, bertindak dengan tidak bertindak itu menyebabkan kita untuk lagi tidak khawatir ya dan mengalami pembebasan yang sifatnya duniawi, worldly. Dalam konteks yang sosial, jadi nggak cuma dalam konteks individual doang tuh, individual penting, tapi nggak cuma sosial, nggak cuma itu doang. Ada juga implikasi yang lebih besar terkait bagaimana kita menjadikan masyarakat itu punya ritme pola dari alam gitu untuk menjadi apa ya sesuai dengan alam gitu ya. Kita perlu praktik individual dan sosial secara sekaligus gitu ya. Nah, yang menjadi argumen utama di dalam tulisannya Prof. Eric ya terkait bagaimana merespon di dalam kondisi di dalam konteks lingkungan ya, environmental ethics gitu ya. Nah, kita bisa nourish atau kita bisa merusak dunia di mana kita tinggal gitu ya. Nah, kita harus memikirkan ulang soal bagaimana kita berinteraksi dengan laut, sungai dan sebagainya dan melihat bahwa mereka punya cara sendiri untuk mereproduksi dan memulihkan diri dengan caranya sendiri. Nah, kita harus memeliharanya, gitu ya. Nah, jadi Tao Te Ching mengajarkan kita untuk menurish atau nourish itu memperkaya ya, nourish diri dan dunia, dan juga mendorong kita untuk menjadi lebih responsif ke dunia. Dan bahkan tadi ya soal Tao Te Ching ini bisa kita baca juga secara anakronistik ya, kita interpretasi ulang. Seperti kita baca teks Aristoteles, teks Plato, kita bisa gunakan dalam konteks yang modern, gitu juga dengan Tao Te Ching. Nah, jadi ini asik nih. Mungkin kita juga bisa mikir bahwa jangan-jangan teks-teks Jawa kuno di luar sana itu bisa kita lakukan reinterpretasi juga, gitu ya. Kita bisa bawa ke dalam konteks kita yang sekarang ini. Nah, ini ide yang menarik ya untuk buat penelitian, gitu ya. Jadi saya jadi penasaran, saya bisa nggak ya? Nah, jadi ada penyesuaian dan reinterpretasi ya seperti Plato, Aristoteles dan kawan-kawan. Nah, jadi teks Tao Te Ching ini menjadi teks yang sangat kaya, gitu loh. Seru ya. Jadi coba untuk baca Tao Te Ching sih kawan-kawan. Aku jadi tertarik gitu ya. So Prof. Eric, maybe this is the last question from me. Do you have any tips for someone who wants to start to learn Taoism? Any recommendations for it?
Mm-hmm. Well, of course, the best place to begin is with a good translation of the Tao Te Ching and the Zhuangzi. Those are remarkable, wonderful texts. Many people, many non-Taoists as well as people interested in Taoism, read these books and learn a lot from them. So just sit down with the Tao Te Ching and the Zhuangzi. And remember that they are a little bit enigmatic, but the enigmas presented throughout the text actually have a certain kind of consequence, right? They have a certain kind of effect that can transform our way of thinking and maybe how we relate to the natural world and to things as well. And so I think those are excellent places to begin, is with the Taoist classics themselves. And of course, there are lots of classical commentaries, like the Heishangong is the commentary that leads into religious Taoism. Wang Bi's commentary has a more kind of conceptual character, and it became more popular among the literati and the educated classes and so on, reading the book. And so the Wang Bi commentary is very useful for getting into how the Tao Te Ching plays such an important role in the formation of Chinese ideas about nature and the self. So those are excellent places to start with. And of course, there are many good books written about Taoism today. So I mentioned my book already, which I, of course, would recommend, but there are many other introductory and more systematic books on the Tao Te Ching and Zhuangzi, and on later forms of Taoism as well. So depending on what one is interested in, one can look at Taoism and aesthetics, Taoism and religion, Taoism and philosophy, politics, and so on. And there's a vast literature about that. But my basic message would be to begin with the texts themselves, right? And then if you're interested, continue to work with those texts, read different translations. Like the Tao Te Ching is one of the most translated works in the world. So there are like hundreds of English translations. There are thousands of other translations in every possible language you can think of. So the Tao Te Ching is this real appeal that you should be able to get into if you want to. And the Zhuangzi is a little bit more complicated because it's much longer, But on the other hand, it's funnier than the Tao Te Ching. There's a lot of humor, a lot of fun passages, a lot of paradoxes, a lot of reversals, a lot of beautiful poetic imagery in the Zhuangzi. And so the Zhuangzi has a great appeal as well. And one can learn a lot from that text as well. Not just in terms of philosophy, but also in terms of the Chinese and East Asian aesthetic tradition that draws a lot from the Zhuangzi and its use of imagery and so on. So those would be two great places to begin.
Ya, jadi teman-teman ada dua ya. Kalau misalnya teman-teman mau belajar Taoism gitu dari pertama, ya langsung aja ke Tao Te Ching ya. Gitu. Jadi langsung baca Tao Te Ching-nya gitu ya. Kayaknya udah diterjemahin ke bahasa Indonesia juga sih Tao Te Ching ya. Kayaknya Gramedia ada terjemahin ke bahasa Indonesia. Tapi selain itu kita juga bisa baca dengan pertolongan komentari gitu. Jadi komentar daripada para penulis setelahnya seperti Huang Ti juga nulis itu. Terus Zhangzi juga itu teks lainnya yang katanya lebih humoris gitu ya. Tapi aku nggak tahu ya cara bacanya, aku juga cari-cari sih. Bingung. Nanti kalau teman-teman tahu teks lain Tao Te Ching itu apa, kasih tahu ke aku ya. Aku nyari-nyari nggak nangkap gitu ya pelafalannya. Nah, jadi itu ya untuk harus dibaca Tao Te Ching sama yang tadi komentarnya Huang tuh. Nah, itu untuk yang mau mulai belajar mempelajari Taoisme itu sendiri gitu loh. Nah, oke, Prof, can I take some questions from the participants?
Sure,
okay?
yes. That'd be great.
So maybe that's the last question from me, but I'll took some questions from the participants.
Sure.
First, I want to take from Jason. Oftentimes, some people understand Tao the same as the way Christian and Greek talk about logos. Are there any differences between Tao and logos regarding the interactions between the West and the East?
That's actually an excellent question, because the early interpretations, Western interpretations of the Tao, actually usually try to relate it to the notion of logos or the notion of reason. So often Tao was translated as logos, as reason, and so on in early Western translations. And there's a lot of discussion because of the Catholic missionaries in China of relations between Chinese classics and then the Christian teachings, but also the Old Testament as well. So there are all sorts of reconstructions of possible historical or conceptual relations between any of the Chinese classics and various aspects of Christianity. And so that really characterizes a lot of the early literature in the 18th and 19th centuries. And so even in the 19th century, if you look at the first German translations of the Tao Te Ching, they're all concerned with connecting the Tao Te Ching with ancient monotheism, right? Almost pre-recorded biblical recording of the monotheistic teaching as Adam would have known it. And so there's always been this aspiration to find in ancient China something that connects with ancient Judaism, right, in the Western imagination. But of course, the sinologists and scholars are very skeptical of that, because Tao is not quite the same thing as logos and or reason, right, in the Greek sense of these terms. So of course, one could give Taoism a very Platonic reading. I think there are some philosophers who move in that direction. One has to be very careful, because it develops in a very different set of cultural and intellectual circumstances. And one of the crucial differences is that in Judaism and Christianity, it is God is the prime mover, right? Is the creator that moves the waters, that moves nothingness into being. But in the Taoist understanding, nothingness stirs itself. In that there is nothing, the nothingness is there, everything begins in nothing, but then there is a stirring in the nothing. And then the one becomes two, right? And they generate the heaven and earth and chi and so on and so forth. So the world is generated out of nothingness, it then returns back to nothingness. So the entire cosmos and nature is a process of generation and of decay back into the source, right? And that's the entire model there. Whereas in the Judeo-Christian tradition, of course, there's the notion of a God outside of that process, making that process possible. So I'd say one of the big differences then between Taoism and monotheism is that Taoism the origin, the development, the generation of things is immanent, right? It's immanent to the world that is created through the Tao. Whereas the Christian idea of logos, of course, is much more involves this transcendent God becoming incarnate through Jesus and the world and so on, depending on how you want to interpret your Christian theology, of course. But there's still this emphasis on transcendence, right, of the God being beyond the world. So in that sense, there's a key set of differences, right, between the Taoist notion of, say, generation of the world, and what the significance of the Tao is. And of course, this has numerous consequences. So if you look at classical Taoist literature, because there is no primordial God, right, there is only the way, then that means there is no God to step in to redeem one or do activities for us and so on, right? One, in a sense, is on one's own for one's self-cultivation or realization of the Tao. But later, religious Taoism is different because there are all sorts of spirits and gods there that intervene for one, right, to help one out and so on. So that becomes closer to the theistic model where you have a God to help one out in different situations. So religious Taoism has a lot of avenues for rituals and prayer and getting things from the religious sphere, right? Kind of intervention.
Yeah, I think, yeah, so we need to careful to take the logos the way Christians understand or Greek with the way the Taoists understand Tao. So, yeah, please let me translate it, Prof. Arik. Ya, jadi tadi Jason singkat ya, intinya beda, gitu, kita nggak bisa samain. Memang ada upaya-upaya menyamakan gitu ya dari para misionaris Kristen atau Katolik dalam mula, gitu ya, tentu untuk menyesuaikan secara kultur kali untuk menyampaikan agama sendiri. Tetapi pada dasarnya beda gitu ya. Taoisme percaya sama nothingness gitu ya, ketidakberadaan. Sedangkan sebaliknya Kristen tuh punya konsepsi yang transenden mengenai Allah gitu ya. Kalau Taoisme dari yang tidak ada ke yang tidak, pokoknya dari nothingness ya, seperti itu ya. Nah, jadi agak agak terburu-buru gitu untuk menyandingkan Kristianitas dengan Taoisme. Jadi harus hati-hati gitu ya. Meskipun nantinya Taoisme itu memang sedikit berubah ya bentuknya ketika di akhir-akhir itu jadi bentuk yang spiritual. Gitu. Okay, it's okay for me to take two other questions. Oh,
sure.
Sure. Thank you. So I'll continue to the other questions. Hi, Professor. Is it valid if I say that Taoism's main idea is reduction, social attribute, or dogma, or anything else that influence our way to value or see life shall be bracketed according to our own belief? So then we will reach in simplicity or the tranquility of mind. Thank you.
That's a very interesting question because again, Taoism, like we can talk about whether it's philosophy, religion, or both, or in between, but it's kind of distinctive in contrast to religion in that it does not have a kind of fundamental verbal like dogma that one has to believe in, right? So when there's no doctrine that the Tao Te Ching or Zhuangzi teaches that everyone has to believe this doctrine or dogma, right? But rather there are a set of practices, and the practices allow one to realize a certain kind of relationship with the universe, a kind of responsiveness to things, a responsiveness to the order of things, right? An attunement with them. And then one finds a kind of tranquility in relationship to that order and the things around one, even as they move and do their own thing. So because of that, the main emphasis in Taoism is kind of, you might say, practical, right? Is how one is living one's life. It is what one is doing or not doing in relationship to oneself and one's world. And then the verbal side of it is not as fundamental. So through paradoxes, often what is taught on one page is a kind of limited or overcome on the next page, because the Tao Te Ching in particular uses a kind of paradoxical form of reasoning or logic that advances through the paradox, so that limited viewpoints or perspectives are overcome and a more expansive perspective is created. And if that is the case, then that will proceed endlessly. So there's no one fundamental, say, statement or proposition or set of propositions or statements that define what it is to be with the Tao in the Tao Te Ching. And in fact, it's the opposite, right? The very first line lines of the Tao Te Ching are the Tao that can be said in a stated propositional way is actually not the real Tao. So if you can say it, it's not it. Because the real Tao is ineffable to language or outside of language, but something one realizes in one's comportment, one's disposition, in relationship to the world.
Oke, thank you, Prof. Jadi, tweet jawabannya singkatnya menarik pertanyaan itu, tapi bukan gitu, karena untuk mendefinisikan atau menggeneralisir Taoisme itu agak sulit gitu, ya, karena ada banyak cara pemahamannya. Tetapi intinya Taoisme itu adalah soal bagaimana kita berrelasi dengan dunia, gitu loh. Jadi apa ya, lebih luas sih konsepnya kalau aku coba pahami gitu. Two other questions, Prof. This one is interesting. I want to ask about Taoism, view about death or painfulness. Is there any relation to Taoism in terms of self-actualization, or they are completely different?
Yeah, so this issue of death, right? What was the second word? Pain?
Yeah, death, painfulness.
Yeah, death. Okay. So death is actually a very interesting concept, right, in Taoism, because Taoism teaches that we should embrace our finitude. And so this connects to this nourishing life aspect of Taoism that I talked about earlier. So one practice of nourishing life in a more purposive way is to try to extend one's life. And so the ancient Chinese developed all these ways of extending life through various physical and spiritual activities, right, to extend one's life. And this goes into the alchemical tradition of trying to extend one's life through various forms of internal or external alchemy. But if you look at the Tao Te Ching, the Zhuangzi, as I read it, and the Lao Tzu text as well, and other ones, in the Wang Bi commentary that I discussed in the book, actually one cannot extend life in that way. And that trying to extend life in that way actually ruins life, destroys life, does not nourishing it. So it's only by abandoning such purposive techniques and calculations about extending life that one can properly nourish life. And so what becomes a condition of nourishing life is accepting death, accepting mortality. And so in a certain sense, in these passages I'm discussing in the book, they come from a multiplicity of early sources. One has to recognize that one has a certain time on the earth, right? One enjoys the fruits of this life, but then one also has to let go of the fruits of this life and this life itself. And so there's a kind of generational thinking in Taoism, whereas Confucianism emphasizes holding on and memorializing the dead, right? Taoism says, embrace the life, nourish the life of the other, but let them go in their death, right? And this is kind of the message of Zhuangzi when he loses his wife. At first he cries, he mourns the death of his wife as anyone would, but then he celebrates her release, right? Her freedom. And that's kind of this Taoist kind of generational idea that we are all born for a time. And the only way to nourish the life that we have is to recognize that we are here for a time as well. And I think this is important for our thinking about the environment and ecology as well. So there's a Western philosophical friend of mine who has this notion of taking turns with the earth, right? He develops in the phenomenological deconstructive context. But I think that phrase, taking turns with the earth, is also an ecological lesson of the Tao Te Ching and Zhuangzi as well, that we have to recognize that we have our turn with the earth and then let go of that. We recognize that generations and peoples have their turn with the earth, but we should be willing to let go when mortality sets in, right? And by doing that, we recognize certain limits. We recognize that the earth is not only ours, but belongs to, say, future generations as well. That we should not simply consume and use everything and destroy it, right, as many people do, but rather we should preserve it. We should nourish it, not just for the sake of ourselves and our current generation, but for the generations to come as well that will replace us. So this notion of nourishing life, when we think of it in these generational terms, has this important ecological, environmental insight that we can connect it with. And that's what I argue in my book in certain places.
I see. No, please let me translate it again.
Yes,
Jadi ya sebenarnya konsep untuk memperpanjang hidup ya, extending life itu salah satu hal yang penting sih dalam Taoisme. Dan bahkan sebagian orang itu berusaha berbagai cara ya, lewat alchemy, atau kayak Si Huangdi kali ya. Si Huangdi kan minum merkuri bahkan ya, untuk apa namanya, perpanjang hidupnya gitu ya. Nah, jadi poin penting, tapi buat Taoisme bukan lewat cara-cara seperti itu gitu ya. Justru untuk menjadi orang yang apa ya, memperpanjang kehidupannya, dia itu harus untuk merangkuh keterbatasannya gitu ya, merangkuh keterbatasannya. Dan poin yang menarik tadi itu ya, kalau Konfusianisme itu menganggap bahwa yang namanya mengingat orang-orang mati sebagai tindakan yang penting. Tapi justru di dalam Taoisme, tindakan untuk ia mengingat, tapi at the same time kita juga harus melupakan dan berjalan melangkah ke depan gitu ya. Perspektif yang lebih generasional gitu ya. Jadi kita nggak cuma hidup apa ya, nggak cuma hidup di dalam kungkungan yang namanya mengingat orang-orang yang mati, tapi untuk langkah ke depan. Dan ini termasuk juga berkaitan dengan isu lingkungan gitu ya. Jadi kita mengingat bahwa lingkungan ini bukan cuma soal kita aja nih, tapi ada orang-orang yang nantinya akan memiliki tanda kutip dunia atau bumi ini gitu. Itu in a brief way ya, secara singkat, panjang banget dan sangat kaya sih. Okay, one last question, Prof. Eric. So this one is from Benny. Thank you for your explanation about nourishing life and Oriental philosophy. It seemed to me that Taoism put more emphasis on the role for spiritual cultivation and for being harmonious with nature. Other Chinese teachings, such as Chinese Buddhism, has an emphasis on concept of wisdom and compassion for enlightenment that seem to be very social for me. They also have sanghas for helping people to be spiritually enlightened, while Confucianism also puts more attention about virtue within our relationship to family, state, and others. What do you think about this? Is it true that Taoism, compared to other Chinese ethics, pay more attention to the individual aspect rather than social aspects within the spiritual cultivation training?
So this is an excellent question as well, because one aspect of Taoism is that there is a kind of individualism. So some philosophers and sociologists think individuality is mostly a Western concept, but insofar that we can talk about individualism and so on in the Asian context, it's definitely a characteristic that we see in the, say, Taoist traditions, because often Taoism is associated with figures who leave society, right, who refuse to serve the political leaders of the day. So there are a number of stories in the Zhuangzi about Zhuangzi himself, right, that the prince commands him to serve and he refuses to do so, right? He would rather just sit on the riverside fishing and not serve in the political offices with all of their ceremonies and stress and so on and so forth. So there is this kind of individualistic side that often takes on either an anti-political tone. So a number of people influenced by Taoism become kind of anti-political. They want us to stay outside of the political to keep ourselves intact, to nourish life in different ways. But another aspect of Taoism that comes out through the later sections of the Zhuangzi, in the reception of the Zhuangzi into Neo-Taoism, is what we might call a quasi-libertarian or anarchistic way of looking at society. That the best ruler is the one who does not rule, right, directly, purposively, but allows people to rule themselves. And so then you get a vision of the political order, right, where people are allowed to generate their own way of life in relationship to each other. And this is how society is most efficacious, where you have the best possible society, not by ordering things, by ruling over them, by domination, but by letting things happen, just as we let things happen in nature, right, as they should or as they do, so also in society as well. So that's another aspect of certain forms of Taoism as well. So there are other forms of Taoism that have more of a kind of hierarchical sense of the political, where it's all about the sage king ruling in various ways. But there is this tendency in a certain form of Taoism to be either apolitical or even kind of individualistic, or a more emphasizing spontaneity in the political than more typical forms of, say, Chinese philosophy. But it's interesting, Confucianism sometimes can share some of these ideas, but disagree about how to achieve them. So for example, Confucius is said to also have emphasized Wu Wei, right? But one achieves that state of Wu Wei through a kind of moral rectitude, moral cultivation. Likewise, one produces a self-generative society, community through a moral ordering of the self, right, by all the individuals within it. So there are connections too between Taoism and Confucianism, that at times they share similar ideas, but then how they interpret them and how they interpret achieving them can vary greatly. And I think this kind of Taoist side of Chinese thought, even though it's not usually the dominant one, hardly ever the dominant one in Chinese society, always has a certain kind of power or influence, right, that could run counter to the given society or political order of the day. And we should also see that these Taoist concepts and models and ideas also shape later forms of Chinese philosophizing. So when Buddhism was introduced into China, it was introduced through the language of Taoism initially. And that kind of Taoist set of characteristics is deeply influential, not just of the philosophical forms of Chinese Buddhism, but in particular Chan or Zen Buddhism adopts many of the images and kind of strategies from iconoclastic and paradoxical strategies from Taoism. But even Neo-Confucian metaphysics, many of the central key concepts are developed through the fusion of Buddhist, Taoist, and Neo-Taoist ideas earlier. So Taoism does play this important role throughout the formation of Chinese philosophy. And I think it has a certain appeal, right, in different eras for different reasons. So some will find it appealing due to this kind of bio-spiritual self-cultivation idea, but others find something else, say, emphasizing the role of the individual or a certain kind of eccentric form of life, you might say, or doing one's own thing, right, in accordance with nature. So Taoism has always been this like resource for people to use to counter, right, the existing order of things, so to speak. And so I think
Yeah.
Taoism has kind of critical function, right, in Chinese history and Chinese society. And that's one of the other appealing things about Taoism in Chinese history.
Okay, thank you, Prof. Eric. Yeah, so please let me translate it. Cukup panjang, tapi intinya ya memang nuansanya Taoisme itu cukup individualis ya. Jadi orang-orang pikir kalau yang namanya individualisme itu asal dari Barat gitu, tapi ada nuansa-nuansa individualistis di dalam Taoisme itu sendiri gitu ya. Bahkan nuansa libertarian di dalam memahami soal negara. Jadi untuk memimpin yang baik adalah untuk tidak memimpin gitu ya, ya tipikal-tipikal ini ya libertarianisme gitu loh ya, untuk membiarkan yang namanya pemimpin itu jadi penjaga malam. Nah, jadi ada nuansa begitu di dalam Taoisme gitu loh. Jadi memang bisa dibilang ada kecenderungan ke sana sih ya dari apa yang disampaikan sama Prof. Eric gitu. Dan hopefully cukup panjang ya, aku nggak bisa translate semua juga sih, segitu aja kali ya. Aku tadi nggak nyatet gitu. Oke. Jadi kayaknya itu ya teman-teman, aku pikir kita bisa akhirin. Aku mau minta Prof. Eric itu menyampaikan penutup gitu. So Prof. Eric, I think those are the questions. Could you close this discussions with maybe with your conclusions maybe, or anything you want to say?
Sure. So thank you, Samuel, for inviting me to talk to you all today. And thank you all for attending. I hope you learned something about my understanding of philosophy and Taoism and how they relate to each other. And again, I want to say that we should not dogmatically divide Taoism into Taoist philosophy and Taoist religion and so on. Because of course, many Asian forms of philosophy, religion, they have a lot of overlapping interconnections. And so we can't artificially separate them. But at the same time, insofar that we are lovers of wisdom, students of philosophy, we want to inquire into the Taoist traditions, whether they be more literati or more religious in a philosophical way. And so I think we can look at a variety of traditions and practices, whether they define themselves as religious or not, and look at them in a philosophical way to further question, right? Not just question what they have to say or question what they're doing, but question ourselves as well, and interrogate what is the character of, say, the self. What does it mean to be a self, right? What does it mean to relate to a community? Should it be more individualistic and self-organizing, or should it be more controlled and dominated from the center? And what is the nature of the cosmos as well? Is the cosmos a hierarchical order, a great chain of being? Or is it more of this spontaneous happening of things where each thing, right, has a center, or is a center, right, of the world at the same time that every other thing is a center of the world as well? So I think Taoism is a very compelling model for philosophers to consider, because it presents us with a way of looking at the plurality of things as having their own intrinsic way of being and non-being, right, that we should uh, keep in our regard, that we should attend to, that we should be responsive to as much as possible. And so I think there are a number of important implications and lessons that these Taoist teachings have for philosophy, but also for how we relate to the environment as well. And so I hope all of you will, if you want to, will consider Taoism as something to think about in your philosophical reflections or whatever else you are doing. But anyway, thank you very much for attending. I hope you found it informative. And if you have any questions that you want to address me, you can always send me an email. So it's very nice talking to you all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Prof. Eric. And I think if you want to read Prof. Eric writings, you could access it in Research Get Responding with Tao, Early Taoist Ethics and the Environment. You can download the full text PDF, and or
Yes.
you could buy the your book, Taoism.
Yeah. So this article, yeah.
Taoism
So
and
this,
Environmental Philosophy,
yeah. So if you're interested in the article Responding with Tao, I have it posted on my academia edu site. So I have many of my articles there that you can download for, I think you just have to sign up, then you can download the articles there. And if you're interested in, if you like the Responding with Tao article and want to read more, then you could get your library or a PDF copy of the book, which is a longer account. So it covers some similar issues, but it's 12 years afterwards. So it's slightly different, more refined at the same time.
Sure. Okay. Thank you, Paris. We're really grateful for you. So, hopefully we have other opportunities to have other talk with you. And thank you for attending it at 4 a.m. in California. Yeah, we really,
yes, it's very early here.
We really owe you. Thank you, Prof. Eric. See you around and see you many times.
Okay, thanks everyone. Take care. Okay, bye-bye. Good night or good morning.